The smoke still hung thick over Dustwater Creek when they dragged me from the alley behind Murphy's General Store. My stomach had been gnawing at my ribs for 3 days straight, and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery had driven me to desperation. I never meant for the oil lamp to tip over when I reached for that loaf of bread through the back window. The flames spread faster than wildfire across prairie grass, consuming the wooden building in minutes. Now half the town stood in ashes, and every finger pointed at me. Sheriff Coleman's iron grip bit into my shoulder, as angry voices rose around us like a gathering storm. "String him up," shouted old Mrs. Henley, her face twisted with rage and soot. "That little devil burned down half our town." The crowd pressed closer, their faces illuminated by the dying embers of what used to be Main Street. I was just 14, barely more than skin and bones, but in their eyes I saw the kind of fury that turns ordinary folks into something dangerous. My heart hammered against my ribs as I searched the sea of faces for even one person who might show mercy. "Please, I didn't mean to," I started, but the sheriff's backhand cut my words short. Blood trickled from my split lip as I stumbled backward, the taste of copper filling my mouth. "Save your lies, boy," Coleman growled, his badge catching the firelight. 3 buildings gone, including the church where good people come to pray on Sundays. The crowd murmured their agreement, some clutching Bibles to their chests, while others fingered the ropes hanging from their saddles. I had lived on the streets of this town for 2 years since my pa died of consumption, invisible to most, but now I was the center of their world. Behind the sheriff, I caught sight of Ezra Murphy surveying the remains of his store, his life's work reduced to charred timber and ash. His wife Sarah stood beside him, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her cheeks. They had been kind to me before, sometimes leaving scraps of food where they knew I'd find them. Now Mrs. Murphy wouldn't even look in my direction, and I understood that whatever small kindness this town had shown me was as dead as the embers at our feet. The wind shifted, carrying the acrid smell of destruction across the gathered crowd. "We ought to make an example of him," called out Jeremiah Hastings, the town's blacksmith. His massive arms crossed over his barrel chest. "Can't have orphan trash burning down our homes whenever they get hungry." His words cut deeper than any blade, because I knew he spoke what most of them were thinking. I wasn't just some boy who'd made a terrible mistake. I was a problem that needed solving. The rope in his hand seemed to grow heavier, as more voices joined his call for swift justice. My legs felt weak beneath me, but there was nowhere to run with the entire town forming a circle around the sheriff and me. Dr. Harrison pushed through the crowd, his black medical bag still in hand from tending to those hurt in the fire. "Now hold on, folks," he said, raising his voice above the angry murmur. "This boy's no older than my own son would have been." For a moment, hope flickered in my chest like a candle in the wind, but then I saw the doctor's eyes, filled with the same grief and anger as the rest. "That don't change what he's done," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "My medical supplies all gone. How am I supposed to help people now?" The crowd's anger was building like pressure in a steam engine, ready to explode into violence. Reverend Matthews had lost his church, the place where he'd preached every Sunday for 15 years. The school mom, Miss Rebecca, had lost her books and slate boards. Even the saloon keeper, Big Jim Crawford, was mad about losing his whiskey stock in the fire that jumped from building to building. Every person in that crowd had lost something, and I was the only one left to blame. The weight of their collective grief and rage pressed down on me like a heavy stone. "I got rope," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "There's a good strong oak tree right outside town." The words sent ice through my veins, and I started to shake, despite the heat still radiating from the smoldering ruins. This wasn't just talk anymore. They were serious about ending my life right here, right now. Sheriff Coleman's hand moved to his gun, but I couldn't tell if it was to stop the crowd or to help them. The line between law and mob justice was getting thinner by the minute, and I was caught right in the middle with nowhere to turn. "Wait just a minute." A voice cut through the chaos like a knife through leather. The crowd turned as one toward the sound, and I saw a tall figure stepping forward from the shadows near the burned-out church. It was Thomas Whitmore, the cattle rancher from outside town, still wearing his trail dust and spurs. His weathered face was grim, but his eyes held something different from the rest. Not anger, but careful consideration. "I saw what really happened," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being heard. "This boy didn't start that fire." The crowd fell silent as death, every eye now fixed on Whitmore as he stepped into the circle of firelight. My heart stopped beating for what felt like an eternity, because I knew that whatever he said next would decide whether I lived to see another sunrise. The sheriff's grip on my shoulder tightened, and I could feel the tension in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Someone in the crowd saw the truth, but would anyone believe him, and more importantly, would it be enough to save my life? Thomas Whitmore stepped closer to the center of the crowd, his boots crunching on broken glass and debris. I was bringing my cattle through town when I saw someone running from Murphy's store right before the flames started, he said, his voice steady and clear. Someone bigger than this scrawny kid wearing a dark coat and hat pulled low. The crowd shifted uneasily, their bloodthirst cooling just enough to let doubt creep in. Sheriff Coleman's eyes narrowed as he studied Whitmore's face, looking for any sign of deception. I held my breath, afraid that even the smallest sound might break whatever spell was keeping the rope away from my neck. "Are you saying someone else set that fire?" asked Mrs. Henley, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Why would anyone want to burn down our town?" Whitmore removed his hat and ran his fingers through his gray hair, the gesture of a man choosing his words carefully. "I'm saying what I saw with my own eyes, Martha. This boy was in that alley when the fire started, true enough, but he was trying to get away from the flames, not starting them." He pointed toward the charred remains of the bakery. "I saw him stumble and fall, saw the real culprit disappear into the shadows behind the church." The crowd murmured uncertainly, their anger beginning to fragment into confusion and doubt. Sheriff Coleman released his grip on my shoulder slightly, though his hand remained ready to grab me again. "That's a serious accusation, Tom," he said slowly. "You're suggesting someone deliberately burned down half our town." I could see the wheels turning in the sheriff's mind, the lawman in him warring with the part that just wanted simple justice for the angry crowd. Whitmore nodded grimly, replacing his hat with deliberate slowness. "I'm not suggesting anything, Sheriff. I'm telling you what I witnessed." The rancher's reputation in Dustwater Creek was solid as bedrock. He'd never been known to lie or exaggerate, and his word carried weight with the townspeople. Dr. Harrison pushed forward, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hands. "If what you're saying is true, Tom, then we've got a real problem," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "Someone wanted to hurt this town, wanted to destroy what we've built here." The implications of his words rippled through the crowd like ripples in a pond. This wasn't just about a hungry orphan making a terrible mistake. If Whitmore was right, someone had deliberately attacked their community. The thought that one of their own neighbors might be responsible for the destruction was almost too terrible to consider, but it explained the thoroughness of the fire's spread. "I want to hear what the boy has to say," announced Reverend Matthews, stepping forward despite losing his church in the flames. His kind eyes met mine, and I saw something I hadn't expected, compassion mixed with wisdom. "Speak up, son. Tell us your version of what happened." My throat felt dry as dust, but I forced the words out. "I was so hungry, sir. I just wanted some bread from Murphy's back window. When I reached inside, I knocked over an oil lamp by accident." The crowd listened intently, some faces softening slightly at my obvious distress. "The flames caught so fast, and I heard someone running away, but I was too scared to look up." Mrs. Murphy stepped forward, her soot-stained dress rustling in the evening air. "Ezra and I did leave food for this boy sometimes," she admitted quietly, her voice barely audible. "He never caused trouble before, never stole anything, or made problems." Her husband nodded reluctantly, his anger visibly wavering as he looked at my thin frame and frightened eyes. "Sarah's right," he said slowly. "Boy's been nothing but polite the few times we spoke to him." The admission seemed to cost him something, but it was clearly the truth. Even in their grief and loss, the Murphys were honest people who couldn't ignore the facts of their own experience. Big Jim Crawford, the saloon keeper, spat into the dirt and crossed his massive arms. "Well, if someone did this on purpose, they picked the right night for it," he growled. Most folks were at the church social, buildings mostly empty. His observation sent a chill through the gathered crowd because it suggested careful planning rather than random violence. Whoever had started the fire knew exactly when to strike for maximum damage, with minimum risk of being caught. The thought that their attacker might still be among them, might even be standing in this very crowd, made everyone glance nervously at their neighbors. "The question is," said Sheriff Coleman, his voice taking on a more official tone, "who in this town would want to burn us out?" He looked around the circle of faces, his lawman's instincts finally overriding his desire to give the crowd what they wanted. "And why frame this boy for it?" The sheriff's question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications. If someone had deliberately chosen me as a scapegoat, they had shown a cold calculation that was almost worse than the fire itself. They had been willing to let an innocent child hang for their crime, and that realization made several people in the crowd, looked distinctly uncomfortable. Miss Rebecca, the schoolteacher, cleared her throat delicately. "Sheriff, I hate to say this, but there have been some tensions in town lately," she said carefully. "Some folks haven't been happy about certain business decisions, certain changes coming to Dustwater Creek." Her words were diplomatic, but I could see several people shift uncomfortably, understanding exactly what she meant. There had been talk of the railroad coming through, talk of outside investors buying up land, talk of the town changing in ways that some of the old-timers didn't like. Maybe someone had decided to take drastic action to stop that progress. Thomas Whitmore studied the faces around him with the sharp eyes of a man used to reading cattle and weather and trouble on the horizon. "I think," he said slowly, "that we need to ask ourselves who benefits if this town fails, who wins if we're too busy rebuilding to pursue other opportunities." His words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of realization and suspicion. The crowd began to look at each other differently, wondering who among them might harbor such dark intentions. And somewhere in that sea of faces, I realized the real arsonist was probably watching and listening, hoping their plan would still succeed in destroying both the town and one innocent orphan boy. The crowd began to disperse into smaller groups, their unified anger fracturing into whispered conversations and suspicious glances. Sheriff Coleman kept me close as he walked with Whitmore toward the remains of Murphy's store, their boots crushing charred debris with each step. "Show me exactly where you saw this person," the sheriff said, his voice all business now. The rancher pointed toward a narrow gap between the general store and the bakery, where deep boot prints were still visible in the soft earth. The prints were too large to be mine, and they led away from the fire rather than toward it, just as Whitmore had claimed. "These tracks head straight for the church," observed Dr. Harrison, who had followed us despite the late hour. He knelt beside the prints, his medical training making him naturally observant of details others might miss. "See how deep they are in the front? This person was running hard, probably carrying something heavy." Sheriff Coleman crouched down next to him, studying the evidence with growing interest. The boot prints were clear and distinct, showing a worn sole with a distinctive notch near the heel. "We need to check everyone's boots in town," the sheriff muttered. But even as he said it, we all knew how impossible that would be. A commotion near the church ruins caught our attention, and we hurried over to find Jeremiah Hastings arguing with his younger brother, Marcus. "I'm telling you, Jerry, I saw you leave the social early," Marcus was saying, his voice strained with emotion. "You said you had business to attend to, remember?" The blacksmith's face flushed red with anger or embarrassment. "So what if I did? A man's got a right to leave when he pleases." But there was something in his defensive tone that made Sheriff Coleman step closer, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. The crowd was beginning to gather again, drawn by the sound of raised voices and family conflict. "What kind of business, Jerry?" pressed his brother, and I could see tears forming in Marcus's eyes. "The kind that involves burning down our neighbors' homes?" The accusation hung in the air like a physical blow, and Jeremiah Hastings went very still. His massive hands, so skilled at working iron and steel, slowly clenched into fists at his sides. "You watch your mouth, little brother," he said quietly, but there was real menace in his voice now. "You don't know what you're talking about." The family resemblance between the brothers was strong, but where Marcus looked frightened and confused, Jeremiah looked dangerous. Thomas Whitmore stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the blacksmith's boots. "Jerry," he said calmly, "mind if we take a look at your footwear?" The request seemed reasonable enough, but Jeremiah took a step backward, his retreat telling us more than words ever could. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered, but his voice cracked slightly. "You're going to take the word of some drifter over a man who's lived in this town his whole life?" His desperate attempt to discredit Whitmore only made him look more guilty, and several people in the crowd began nodding to each other, pieces of a puzzle falling into place. Sheriff Coleman drew his gun with practiced ease, not pointing it directly at anyone but making its presence known. "Jerry, I need you to lift up your right foot," he said in the tone he used when he meant business. "Let's see the sole of that boot." The blacksmith's face went pale beneath his soot stains, and sweat began to bead on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "This is madness," he whispered, but his feet remained planted firmly on the ground. "I've got rights, Coleman. You can't just—" His words died as his brother Marcus gasped and pointed at something on the ground near Jerry's feet. "The notch," Marcus exclaimed, his voice breaking with emotion. "That's the same mark that's been on your boot for months, ever since you stepped on that piece of broken horseshoe in your shop." Everyone could see it now, the distinctive wear pattern that matched perfectly with the tracks leading away from the fire. Jeremiah Hastings, the town blacksmith, The man who had called for my lynching just minutes earlier was the real arsonist. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow, and I saw several people step backward, as if trying to distance themselves from a dangerous animal. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had wanted to see me hang was the one who deserved the rope. "Why, Jerry?" asked Mrs. Murphy, her voice thick with pain and betrayal. "Why would you burn down our town?" The blacksmith's shoulders sagged, as if a great weight had settled on them, and for the first time since I'd known him, Jeremiah Hastings looked smaller than his reputation. "The railroad," he said quietly, the words barely audible. "They were going to put me out of business, bring in their own smiths and their own supplies." His admission sent ripples of understanding through the crowd, because everyone knew about the railroad negotiations. I thought if the town was gone, they'd look elsewhere for their depot. Dr. Harrison shook his head in disgust. "So you were willing to destroy everything we've built, willing to let an innocent boy hang for your crime?" The moral weight of what Jeremiah had attempted, not just arson, but murder by proxy, seemed to settle on everyone present. He had been ready to watch me die to cover his own tracks, ready to let the community tear itself apart over a lie. "I never meant for it to spread so far," he said weakly, but the excuse fell flat in the face of the destruction around us. "I just wanted to slow things down, make the railroad think twice." The crowd's mood shifted again, but this time their anger had a proper target. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward with his handcuffs, the metal gleaming in the firelight. "Jeremiah Hastings, you're under arrest for arson and attempted murder," he announced formally. The blacksmith didn't resist as the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, his head hanging in shame and defeat. As they led him away toward the jail, I realized that my life had been saved not by my own innocence, but by the sharp eyes of a rancher who had been in the right place at the right time. The truth had almost come too late, and if not for Thomas Whitmore's courage in speaking up, I would have been dancing at the end of a rope while the real criminal walked free. The jailhouse door clanged shut behind Jeremiah Hastings with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire town. Sheriff Coleman emerged from the building, keys jingling in his hand, and found me still standing in the street, surrounded by the same people who had wanted to lynch me just an hour earlier. The mood had changed completely. Where before I had seen hatred and fury, now I saw shame and embarrassment in their faces. Mrs. Henley, who had been the loudest voice calling for my death, couldn't even meet my eyes as she hurried past. The weight of how close they had come to murdering an innocent child was settling on everyone's conscience like a heavy blanket. Thomas Whitmore approached me with his hat in his hands, his weathered face kind but serious. "Son," he said quietly, "I'm sorry it took so long for someone to speak up for you." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of genuine regret and respect. A man should always stand up for what's right, and I should have done it sooner. I found myself unable to speak, overwhelmed by the mixture of relief and gratitude flooding through me. This stranger had risked the town's anger by defending me, had been willing to contradict a mob to save my life. Without his intervention, I would have been buried in the town cemetery by morning, another forgotten victim of frontier justice. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat and stepped forward, his medical bag still clutched in his hands. "Boy," he said, his voice gentle now instead of angry, "when did you last have a proper meal?" The question caught me off guard, and I realized that my original hunger, the thing that had led to this whole nightmare, was still gnawing at my stomach. "3 days ago, sir," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The doctor nodded grimly and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small wrapped bundle. "Mary packed extra cornbread for me," he said, pressing it into my hands. "It's not much, but it'll help until we can figure out something more permanent." Mrs. Murphy appeared at my elbow, her face streaked with tears but her voice steady. "Ezra and I have been talking," she said, glancing back at her husband who stood among the ruins of their store. "We've lost our business, but we haven't lost our humanity." She paused, seeming to gather courage for what she was about to say. "We'd like you to come stay with us, at least until we can get back on our feet." The offer stunned me into silence. These people had every reason to resent me, even knowing I wasn't truly responsible for their losses. Instead, they were offering me the one thing I had never had, a real home with people who cared whether I lived or died. Reverend Matthews stepped out of the shadows, his clerical collar askew, and his clothes still dusted with ash from his destroyed church. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of deep faith. "Sometimes it takes a great tragedy to reveal the truth that was hidden in darkness." He looked around at the gathered townspeople, his gaze settling on each face in turn. We came very close to committing a terrible sin tonight, and we must never forget how easily fear and anger can lead good people astray. His words carried a weight that went beyond simple preaching. They were a warning and a reminder of human frailty. Sheriff Coleman joined our small group, his official duties completed for the moment. "I'll be sending word to the territorial judge about Jerry's case," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of sadness and determination. What he did was wrong, but the way we almost handled it was worse. He looked directly at me and I saw something like respect in his eyes. "You showed more courage tonight than most grown men, boy." Standing there facing down that crowd took real grit. The sheriff's approval meant more to me than I could express. He was the law in Dustwater Creek, and his respect transformed me from a suspected criminal into a young man worthy of consideration. As the crowd began to disperse, people started approaching me one by one. Miss Rebecca, the schoolteacher, offered to help me learn to read and write properly. Big Jim Crawford, gruff as always, mumbled something about having work available at his saloon if I was willing to earn my keep honestly. Even old Mrs. Henley, who had been so eager to see me hanged, pressed a silver dollar into my palm with a whispered apology. The transformation was remarkable. In the space of a single evening, I had gone from being the town pariah to someone worthy of their concern and assistance. The fire had destroyed buildings, but it had also revealed something important about the character of Dustwater Creek's people. Thomas Whitmore prepared to mount his horse and return to his ranch, but he paused beside me one last time. "Remember this night, son," he said seriously. "Remember how important it is to speak up when you see injustice, even when it's dangerous or unpopular." He swung into his saddle with the easy grace of a lifelong horseman. "The truth has a way of coming out eventually, but sometimes it needs a little help from brave folks willing to stand up for what's right." His words would stay with me for the rest of my life, a reminder of the debt I owed to his courage and the responsibility I now carried to help others in similar situations. The sun was beginning to rise over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost impossibly beautiful after the darkness of the night. The burned buildings looked different in the morning light, still ruined, but somehow less hopeless. Mrs. Murphy took my hand gently, her touch warm and reassuring. "Come on, child," she said softly. "Let's get you home and fed proper." As we walked away from the scene of destruction and near tragedy, I realized that sometimes the worst moments in life can lead to the best outcomes. I had found a family, a community, and a sense of belonging that I had never known before. I was just a hungry orphan who had been blamed for a fire I didn't start, but someone in the crowd had seen the truth and been brave enough to speak it. That simple act of courage had saved my life and revealed the real character of the people around me. As Dustwater Creek began the long process of rebuilding, I knew I would be part of that effort, not as an outsider looking in, but as a member of the community with a place and a purpose. The fire had taken away buildings and belongings, but it had given me something far more valuable, the knowledge that even in the darkest moments, truth and justice can prevail if good people are willing to stand up for what's right.